Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Sustaining Sustainability. I'm your host, CB Bhattacharya, Professor and Director of the Center for Sustainable Business at the University of Pittsburgh. This week, I'm joined from Washington, D.C. by Alex Thier. Alex is the CEO of the Global Fund to End Modern Slavery, a multi-donor fund that has reached almost $90 million to date and is working to eradicate forced labor and human trafficking around the world. Alex was appointed by President Obama as the Chief of Policy, Planning, and Learning at the U.S. Agency for International Development, where he served from 2010 to 2015. And he was the Executive Director of the Overseas Development Institute, a think tank in London focused on economic development, climate, and conflict. Alex, welcome to the show.
Thank you, CB. It's a real pleasure to be with you today.
And likewise. So, Alex, before we dive into the big questions, could you begin by telling us about the why behind your own professional journey to become the CEO of the Global Fund to End Modern Slavery? How would you define your personal purpose?
Absolutely. Well, because Afghanistan is in the news, it might be worth just taking a minute to tell that story. When I was just out of undergraduate in the early 90s, I went to Afghanistan to be a humanitarian aid worker. And I spent about 4 years there during the Civil War, working for the United Nations and Oxfam and some other great organizations. And what I saw there was a situation where so many people were suffering for the benefit of a really few. And what we needed not only was to serve people directly to help them through those difficult times, but actually to change the system that was oppressing them. And really, so much of my life's work has been about that, about taking ideas about big things that need to be worked on. I've worked on genocide and atrocity prevention. I've worked on addressing extreme poverty. In recent years, I've worked on climate and dealing with democracy and rising authoritarianism. And the big idea for me is, how do you take ideas about these things that need to change and actually drive them towards real action that have tangible impact for real ideas? And so having the opportunity to work on modern slavery, a condition that amazingly affects about 40 million people around the world, it's truly one of the biggest human rights and dignity crises that we have on the planet. And I'm really honored to have the opportunity to be working on it.
That is so refreshing to hear. For the listeners, could you explain in very simple terms what do you mean by modern slavery?
Absolutely. About 20 years ago, the international community and different organizations from civil society and other places got together to look at a series of different issues that were causing challenges. And they came up with this idea of modern slavery. And it essentially consists of three things. It consists of people who are in conditions of forced labor, who are under coercion, and don't have a choice to be performing that labor, can't get out of it. The second, which is obviously closely related, but specifically is around what's known as sex trafficking, forced commercial sexual exploitation. And the third is around people, mostly girls, but also boys, who are in forced marriage. And together, between the United Nations and others, they came together to define this and to look at ways to eradicate it and prevent it.
Hmm. So, if you were to comment on the purpose of the Global Fund to End Modern Slavery, how would you describe that, and how has that purpose changed over time, if at all?
Well, one of the things I love about working for the Global Fund to End Modern Slavery is that our purpose is really right there on the tin. We are a fund that is meant to bring together many donors, really to escalate and scale efforts to end the plague of modern slavery. And so, what we do is we bring together donors. We have now in the fund multiple donor governments. We have some private foundations, and we've even managed to get some contributions from corporations to pursue this purpose uh, of essentially looking at what it really takes to change the systems that perpetuate modern slavery, that perpetuate conditions of forced labor and commercial sexual exploitation.
Would you be willing to give one example of where you actually have affected some change in the system from any part of the world?
Absolutely. I think our work in the Philippines is actually a great example. Millions of overseas workers leave the Philippines in search of good jobs, safe jobs, particularly in East Asia and in the Gulf countries. But far too often, these workers find themselves in situations of exploitation. That exploitation happens because they pay high fees that they're not aware of, and they arrive in places and are told that they're in so much debt that they'll have to work for years and years without any pay at all to get out of it. And their travel documents are taken away, their freedom is taken away. Sometimes people are told that they'll be going into one job, maybe working in a hotel, and instead they'll find themselves in a dangerous industry or indeed in a brothel or something like that. So there's many ways in which this system of migration ends up oppressing people. And so, what we've done with our work in the Philippines is to work on a couple of things simultaneously. So, first, we've got to make sure that the right laws are in place and that those laws are being enforced. And so, we've worked with the government and the legislature in the Philippines to strengthen their legal system. But we've also got to make sure that the recruitment practices are ethical and that unethical recruiters are not operating. At the same time, of course, we're also working directly with the people affected, both to prevent people from getting into situations of modern slavery, but also for those who have, working with them when they get back home or to help them get back home. And we find that working on all of those things simultaneously has a much better chance of reaching the most vulnerable populations and preventing the system that's exploiting people in the first place.
That's amazing. Thank you for sharing that. Um, Moving on, with the onset of COVID 19, there has been a sort of reckoning in US society kind of with what constitutes decent work for all, with many employers struggling to fill openings. Have you seen any shifts at a global level surrounding decent work for all because of COVID 19, particularly in the context of modern day slavery? Or is this priority taking a backseat as companies deal with the immediacy of filling worker shortages?
Well, sadly, CB, both of those things are true. The pandemic has massively heightened vulnerability for so many people, people who already were potentially in conditions of modern slavery and many others. But it's also having, I think, a longer term effect. People who are desperate for work, people who are desperate to migrate for work, are more likely to take risks and chances to do so. They're also likely to take more risks and chances with their health. And so we found that conditions in informal apparel manufacturing sector in Bangladesh, for example, were actually deteriorating, and we tracked an incidence of increased child labor in those factories. And unfortunately, what we were seeing has been confirmed by others. You've seen that the International Labor Organization, for example, came out with child labor estimates this year that show a global increase in child labor. But I don't only want to leave that as a negative because, to be honest, the increasing awareness of vulnerability, the increasing awareness of forced labor is on the rise. And I think that the pandemic and the economic and social and political recovery that is going to come out of that provides us with a really important opportunity to think about how do we build back better? How do we make sure that the criteria for what's acceptable in business rise in this process?
Yeah, and not a moment too soon, I would argue, because many, including me, have contended that COVID is essentially kind of some kind of dress rehearsal for the climate crisis that's impending and that we're already seeing the impact of. And as you and I know, changing climate often exacerbates conditions fostering human trafficking. So, on the solution front, then, what overlap are you seeing in how a company works to decarbonize their footprint and combat climate change with addressing modern day slavery and human rights issues in their supply chains?
Well, CB, it's such a great question because I am a very strong believer that we have to look at the intersections of modern slavery with other major areas of global concern, like climate and the environment, like migration, like gender, because ultimately the solutions to both of these problems are codependent on each other. And environmental destruction is a great example of this. We have research showing that 40% of global deforestation is being done with forced labor. And the reason that that's so powerful is that, of course, deforestation itself is a major cause of rising CO2 emissions and dropping of the world's carrying capacity to absorb CO2. So that's a terrible environmental effect. But it's no mistake that these things go together. Because of the nature of criminality and corruption and poor governance that allows things like this deforestation to exist, are also the same sorts of industries where we find a lot of forced labor. And it's not just about the deforestation, it's also the industries that are rising because of that deforestation. Coffee growing in Brazil, for example, is linked to deforestation, and there's also evidence that there's a lot of forced labor in the coffee industry. Same is true for the cattle industry. And so there are all these powerful intersections. And I think what's critical for us to recognize is that advancement on climate issues, on environmental issues, of dealing with the most vulnerable who are always the most affected, is going to require a lot of attention to these other issues like forced labor as well.
Right. We have to understand those codependencies, as you rightly call them. Um, Now, environmental, social, and governance, also popularly known as ESG metrics, are becoming mainstream topics for a variety of stakeholders, including financiers, regulators, and boards. Supply chain issues like modern slavery becoming an increasingly important part of this framework for addressing a company's sustainability. How, if at all, has the literacy on modern slavery changed over the last years? Are companies tracking any specific metrics that actually help your work?
I think that there has been a good news story about forced labor and modern slavery in supply chains. People, companies are paying a lot more attention to these issues. That said, when people talk about the ESG criteria, the S is often deemed, I think, to be the weakest of the three. And we talk a lot with industry and industry partners. We try to work with them to be better stewards, draw ideas from them. We have a really interesting supply chain tracing tool, an innovation that we've invested in that we're trying to get corporate partners to use in their work to detect forced labor in their supply chains. So there's a lot of cooperation there, but the standards are still somewhat lacking. And so there has really been progress, but there is a lot of work to be done. And that's going to take a combination of public pressure. It's going to take governments acting more strongly to prevent products made with forced labor from coming into their economies. And of course, it's going to take the companies saying, this is just not how we do business, and being willing to be really transparent.
Are there any shining examples out there of companies that take this seriously?
There absolutely are, and although it's challenging, for example, the chocolate sector is a really interesting one because there's been evidence for years of cacao in the sector, and there's been a lot of forced labor rather in cacao farming and picking, particularly child labor. And there have been a number of companies that have tried to set high standards, including a new company called Tony's that you may have seen on your market shelves. But interestingly, they even came under some criticism recently because they were having a challenge of separating their supply chain from a larger manufacturer that they work with. And so I think that there are some really powerful examples of how companies are making very, very strong commitments, like Tony's has made, for example, while at the same time operationalizing that in what are truly global supply chains is going to continue to be a challenge.
Mm. Alex, this is fascinating, but we are coming to the close of our time. So, what call to action would you make to our listeners?
Well, I think that there's a couple of things that listeners can do, must do, CB, to be part of this fight and this movement. The first is always is informing yourself, really being informed about what's going on. Of course, I'll recommend our website. It's a simple one. It's www.gfems.org, where you can learn more about some of the things we've talked about. And so I think being informed is always the first step to good citizenship. The second is using your power as a citizen. It means making sure that your representatives are prioritizing this issue. And the third thing, of course, is making decisions about what you buy and where you buy, and really looking into whether the companies that you are buying from make those sorts of commitments to sustainability and what their modern slavery statements look like. Many of them have that now. And the final one is that we don't directly do a lot of fundraising directly from the public, but we do take donations, and there are many great organizations working on the front lines to eradicate modern slavery.
Alex Thier, thank you so much for spending some of your precious time with us today.
It's such a great pleasure, CB. I appreciate you and your listeners and look forward to hearing from folks.
Before I sign off, I do want to say that this podcast is made possible with the help of my colleagues Chris Gassman, who is Associate Director at the Center for Sustainable Business, and Danny Nye, who's Center Associate at the Center for Sustainable Business. I'm your host, CB Bhattacharya, and I'll be back in a couple of weeks with another edition of Sustaining Sustainability.